The crowd roared as the rope tightened around Wallace's neck, cutting off his air and the sound of his own voice. Their cheers echoed in his ears as he struggled to keep his head above the chopping block, his eyes wide and furious. The executioner gave a mocking salute, and for a moment their gazes held, the condemned man and the crowd. Then, with a guttural cry, Wallace slumped, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. But the rope snapped taut again as the executioner, with a grin, dropped the lever that held it in place. A cheer went up, but it was cut short by a cough from somewhere near the front of the crowd. Someone shouted, "He's still alive," and a murmur rippled outward, quickly rising to a cacophony of surprise and disappointment. More than one onlooker would recall the sudden hush that fell as the understanding dawned, the knowledge that the spectacle was far from over. With a shrug, the executioner pulled his hood further over his face, shielding his features as he prepared for the second part of the sentence, the drawing. First, his arms were hacked off, then his legs. Blood blossomed across the scaffold, staining the wood a deep crimson and slicking the cobbles below. It wasn't a clean death, not even close. As spectators crowded closer, eager for a better view, the executioner sliced away the entrails, holding them aloft so that all could see. Even the officials watching from afar had to avert their eyes at times. Finally, with Wallace drained of blood and life, the executioner picked up his head by the hair, dangled it over the edge of the scaffold, and let out a triumphant yell. Then he cut away the remaining flesh until only bone was left. These pieces were thrown into the crowd. Some onlookers caught them, holding them up like trophies. Others recoiled in disgust. Then the skull was cracked open, revealing the brain within. Again, the executioner flung a chunk toward the crowd, where it hit a woman in the stomach. She screamed and fell. Unnoticed, the executioner took the rest of the skull and split it in two. The executioner finished his grim task, tossing the last bits of bone and viscera into the crowd. Once everything was distributed, he pulled his hood back, revealing a face streaked with blood and grinning widely. The officials watching the spectacle from afar signaled for the final portion of the sentence, the quartering. Wallace's body, already dead, was chopped into 4 pieces. The executioner collected the largest section, raised it high, and bore it toward the 4 corners of the city, stopping at the gate in each direction to make sure that all could see. The other 3 sections were carried away by his assistants, disappearing into the city. Alone at the center of the square, the executioner held the bloody stump where Wallace's head had been, and he turned in a slow circle, displaying it to the silent crowd. When he finally lowered the piece of flesh, it was to a smattering of applause. The crowd, having consumed its fill of blood and guts, began to drift away. Many stopped by the butcher shops lining the square to pick up chunks of meat for dinner that night, unknowingly eating the last remnants of William Wallace. Back at the tower, the head of Wallace was cut from the stump and sent to be hung from the top of the structure, a macabre warning to any who looked up. The boy who would grow up to be the legendary hero of Scottish lore didn't know it yet. But his bones were scattered, his body disposed of. The most famous parts of him, his heart and his head, were turned into gruesome displays. Few people walked away from Smithfield that day feeling anything but entertained, and those who had gawked and cheered, laughed and clapped. On August 23, 1297, the scaffold at Smithfield stood like a solemn stage, prepared for one of history's most remembered trials of strength and will. Its weathered wooden planks creaked under the combined weight of guards, officials, and the prisoner. Wallace, secured with iron restraints and ropes, stood at the center, a figure whose fate had drawn the eyes of an entire city. For those gathered, this was far more than the formal carrying out of a sentence. It was a statement of royal authority, a carefully staged reminder of the power of the crown over those who challenged it. The first stage of the proceedings began with a public suspension, intended to mark the formality and seriousness of the judgment. This was not a swift conclusion, but rather a measured act meant to weaken the prisoner and display the reach of the law. The rope, suspended from a crossbeam above, was placed around his neck with deliberate ceremony. There was no speech or final address. At the signal, the rope was drawn upward, and Wallace was lifted from the platform. The crowd reacted with a mixture of cheers, jeers, and silence, each person drawn into the gravity of the event. At first, his body tensed as he struggled against the restraint, but his movements gradually slowed. Before he lost consciousness, the rope was loosened, and he collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily. The initial stage had ended, but more was to follow. Next came a phase designed to diminish his public standing and mark the severity of his crime. Wallace was secured onto a low wooden block, his movements restricted by ropes. This act, performed openly, was meant to remove all symbols of dignity and serve as a visible consequence for his defiance. The officials continued with the subsequent stage, one that was a required element of the sentence for high treason in that era. Historical records note that this phase involved symbolic actions representing the removal of power and defiance from the condemned. With the remains treated according to legal customs of the time, Wallace endured these proceedings with notable resolve, maintaining a fixed gaze beyond the assembled crowd, as though his thoughts were elsewhere. The overseeing authorities ensured that each step was performed strictly in line with the legal decree. After a short pause, the final formalities were prepared, including the symbolic conclusion of the sentence, which would complete the process in its entirety. Now, more than 7 centuries have passed since that fateful day in 1297 when brave Sir William Wallace stood defiant in the face of England's oppressive rule. His story, etched in the annals of Scottish history, serves as a testament to the enduring spirit of freedom. But what if we told you there's more to his tale than meets the eye? As the scaffold at Smithfield loomed ominously in the heart of London, an eyewitness account tells us that amongst the crowd watching the execution were 2 men who were not just spectators, but key players in the drama of that day, King Edward I and none other than Sir John Mandeville. Imagine being there in the crowd, the tension palpable as you watch Wallace brought before the towering scaffold. The scene is a stark reminder of a time when justice was served with unwavering severity. But here's where the intrigue deepens. As Wallace stood defiantly, his head held high, despite the noose around his neck, a sudden change of heart seemed to grip the assembled officials. The executioner, with a dramatic flourish, stepped aside, signaling a shift in the grim proceedings. And then, as if scripted in a tale of chivalry, Sir John Mandeville extended a hand towards the condemned man, offering him a choice. Would Wallace accept the chance for a noble end to his life? What would you do in such a situation? Would you seize the opportunity for a more dignified death, or stand firm in your defiant stance? And as the drama on Braveheart is arguably one of the worst movies ever made, however, there's a lot more to the story of William Wallace than Mel Gibson can ever hope to portray. So let's delve into the horrifying details of how he was executed by the English monarchy in 1297. The scaffold was already slick with Wallace's blood. The jeers and shouts of the crowd had grown quieter, replaced by a low, almost electric hum of murmuring voices. Everyone present knew that the most visceral moment was still to come, a part of the sentence that would tear away not only Wallace's life, but the symbolic seat of his courage, his heart. The executioner moved with an unhurried certainty, his leather jerkin darkened in places from the splatter of Wallace's life. He bent over the Scotsman's chest, the knife in his hand catching the thin August sunlight. Wallace's breathing was labored now, each inhale rattling in his chest. His skin was pale, slick with sweat, but his eyes still held that same defiant glint of fire that refused to be put out, even as his body was failing. The executioner pressed the blade just below the ribcage, the steel parted flesh with an ease born of grim expertise. The sound of the cut almost inaudible beneath the collective gasp of the crowd. He worked quickly but methodically, slicing upward toward the sternum, widening the wound with practiced hands. There was no anesthesia, no numbing, only the sheer rawness of steel and human flesh. Wallace's body tensed involuntarily, a shudder running through his frame, followed by a deep, strangled groan. It was not a scream screaming took breath, and breath was scarce. With his hands now inside the cavity, the executioner groped for the organ he sought. When his fingers closed around the still-beating heart, he wrenched it free in one brutal motion. The crowd recoiled, some gasping, others shouting in morbid excitement. The heart, glistening and twitching in his palm, was held aloft for all to see. The ritual words rang out over Smithfield, "Behold the heart of a traitor." The phrase was both proclamation and performance, a signal to the assembled citizens that they were witnessing the ultimate act of royal justice. To Edward I, this moment was as important as the death itself. It was the point at which the body became a symbol. stripped of humanity and reduced to a lesson. The heart was thrown into the boiling cauldron with a hiss and a spray of steam. The air filled with the sickly sweet stench of cooking flesh, so thick it clung to the throat. The cauldron now held the remnants of a man's organs, flesh and bone fragments, dissolving into unrecognizable matter. With Wallace's heart removed, the executioners knew the end was near. They were not men to prolong a spectacle beyond its dramatic peak. The next step was the beheading, and though it lacked the drawn-out agony of the earlier stages, it carried its own brutal weight. 2 guards hauled Wallace upright. His head lolled slightly to one side, the muscles in his neck slacked from exhaustion and injury. Blood from the gaping wound in his torso dripped steadily onto the planks beneath him. He was pushed toward the block alow, sturdy piece of wood stained with the history of countless other deaths. The axe was brought forth, its blade broad and polished to a cold gleam. The executioner took his place, adjusting his grip, measuring the angle. The crowd pressed forward, their voices hushed now, waiting for the final act. Wallace's head was positioned on the block, his cheek resting against the wood. Whether he had the strength left to think, to pray, or to curse his captors, no one could say. Perhaps in that moment, his mind was already far from Smithfield, back in the green hills of Scotland. Among comrades in open skies, the axe fell with a heavy, ringing thunk. The cut was clean. The head rolled into a waiting wicker basket, its eyes still half open, the mouth slightly parted as if in the middle of a word that would never be spoken. For the crowd, the moment was both an ending and a beginning. The man was dead, but the ritual of displaying his remains was just beginning. Edward's justice did not stop at death, extended into the realm of the dead. Turning the corpse into a message that would travel far beyond London, the body was dragged to the side of the scaffold, where it was quickly quartered. Heavy cleavers hacked through joints, separating arms and legs from the torso. Each cut was accompanied by the dull crack of bone and the wet tearing of muscle. The limbs were wrapped in coarse cloth, each marked for a different destination. One arm would hang in Newcastle, another in Berwick. A leg would be sent to Stirling, the other to Perth. Each piece would be mounted in a public place, where the sight of it would serve as a constant silent warning. The torso, now unrecognizable as belonging to the once mighty guardian of Scotland, was discarded with little ceremony. But the head was a trophy. It was placed on a long iron spike and carried through the streets in a grim procession. The people followed, shouting and jeering, though some walked in silence, uneasy at the spectacle. The spike was fixed above the south gate of London Bridge, where all who entered the city from the south would see it. Rain and wind would strip it over time, crows would pick at the soft tissue, and the sun would blacken the remaining skin. Months later, only the skull would remain, a bleached reminder of the king's reach. And yet, even as Edward believed he had destroyed his enemy utterly, the seeds of legend had already taken root. Wallace's story, carried north by word of mouth, sung quietly in taverns, whispered in the halls of Scottish nobles, would not fade. In killing the man so completely, Edward had made him immortal in another way. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. So when the final act of the sentence was over and the officials had completed their duties, the crowd at Smithfield began to disperse. Some left talking animatedly, sharing their impressions with companions who had not been close enough to see the events clearly. Others departed in silence, their expressions solemn, the memory of what they had witnessed lingering in their minds. For the authorities, the matter did not end there. The conclusion of William Wallace's case was intended not as a single day's event, but as a lasting message to the entire realm of Edward I. The king understood that a show of authority had to resonate far beyond the place where it occurred. Carried in stories and retellings to towns and villages across the land, that same afternoon, Wallace's head was transported to London Bridge as part of a formal display. Guards escorted it through the city until it reached the great southern gate of the bridge, where it was mounted in a visible position for travelers to see. Its placement ensured it could be recognized by anyone entering London. It served as a visual reminder of the crown's reach and the consequences of opposing it. Other parts of the sentence were also carried out symbolically in various locations across the kingdom. Messengers traveled to key towns Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perthware. These signs were placed prominently at gates or market squares. The intention was to make the king's message present even in distant corners of the realm. In London, stories of the event quickly spread. Taverns and marketplaces buzzed with conversation, and each retelling added small variations. Some claimed Wallace had shown no sign of fear. Others said he had spoken defiantly until the very end. While details shifted, the central fact remained. The king's justice had been carried out in full view of the people. North of the border, however, the story took on a different tone. In Scotland, word of Wallace's death was passed quietly between trusted voices. To many, it was not a tale of justice served, but of harshness from an occupying power. Songs began to circulate, telling of his campaigns, his capture, and his end. These verses, often sung by traveling musicians, preserved his memory not as that of a criminal, but of a man who had resisted until the last. Even within England, there were some who viewed the sentence with unease. Scholars and courtiers aware of the legal complexities noted that Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward I, raising questions about the charge of treason. Such concerns were spoken of only in private, however, as loyalty to the crown remained paramount. Over time, the impact of the event shifted. While the king had sought to use it as a display of strength, many remembered instead Wallace's steadfastness. His endurance during the proceedings became a source of quiet admiration, particularly among those who opposed English rule in Scotland. Years after Edward I's reign, Wallace's story continued to be told. Parents recounted it to children, and minstrels sang of his deeds. They blended history and legend until the two were indistinguishable. For the Scots, he became a symbol of resistance. For others, a figure whose defiance marked him as extraordinary. Smithfield, already known for public executions, gained another chapter in its long and often grim history. The memory of that date's crowds, its officials, and the solemn weight of the proceedings. Have you ever wondered what the most gruesome form of execution in history was? As we crawl deeper into the annals of history, we find a plethora of dark and disturbing practices that were once considered acceptable forms of punishment. Let's start with one of the most well-known, the Spanish donkey, originating in 15th century Spain. This method involved burning a person alive inside a wooden horse-like structure, but it gets worse. The victim was typically paraded through the streets before their execution, adding a horrifying spectacle to this already grotesque punishment. Now let's move on to the scaphism practiced by the ancient Persians. This form of execution involves sewing up a victim in a boat along with decaying animal matter and then leaving it in the water. The victim would slowly be consumed by maggots and rot, making this a truly gruesome and agonizing death. The Ottoman Empire had their own unique form of capital punishment, the death by 1,000 cuts, as the name suggests. The condemned would be cut into small pieces over a period of several days, often resulting in a slow and excruciating demise. But these are just a few examples. We haven't even scratched the surface of the dark side of human history. When it comes to punishments, imagine being locked in a tiny space with your skin being flayed alive. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? Well, it's not. This was the reality of the slow laceration, a form of punishment used by the Aztecs and other Mesoamerican cultures. And then there's the practice of crucifixion, which goes back even further to the ancient civilizations of the Middle East. You may be familiar with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, one of the most famous accounts of this brutal form of capital punishment. But what was the worst form of execution? Well, that depends on how you define worst. Was it the most painful? Was it the most humiliating? Or was it the one that struck the most fear into the hearts of the people? One thing is for sure, the final act of the sentence was over, and the officials had completed their duties. The crowd at Smithfield began to disperse. Some left talking animatedly, sharing their impressions with companions who had not been close enough to see the events clearly. Others departed in silence, their expressions solemn, the memory of what they had witnessed lingering in their minds. For the authorities, the matter did not end there. The conclusion of William Wallace's case was intended not as a single day's event, but as a lasting message to the entire realm of Edward I. That same afternoon, Wallace's head was transported to London Bridge as part of a formal display. Its placement ensured it could be recognized by anyone entering London, serving as a visual reminder of the Crown's reach. Other parts of the sentence were also carried out symbolically in various locations across the kingdom. Messengers traveled to key towns Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where these signs were placed prominently at gates or market squares. The intention was to make the king's message present even in distant corners of the realm. In London, stories of the event quickly spread. Taverns and marketplaces buzzed with conversation, and each retelling added small variations. Some claimed Wallace had shown no sign of fear. Others said he had spoken defiantly until the very end. While details shifted, the central fact